introduce, I'm going to introduce Mr. Maxwell. From Mr. Maxwell, going to be Mr. Frank. From Mr. Frank, Miss Morris, or the guests can, I want to say, pass the baton on to the one who they want to go after them. So we're going to give our guests freeway tonight, and that is very rare that we give you a freeway. But I want to say that you all are good friends of Just Beyond, and we have been watching and been paying attention to your hard work and your dedication. So we're going to start off with Mr. Maxwell. Can you tell us a little something about yourself and what you do, please?
Certainly, and thank you, Ms. Valerie. My name is Maxwell Chardulo. I am the Director of Policy and Communications at the Louisiana Fair Housing Action Center. And I think my initial piece here was I'm going to give you a little background information about the Healthy Homes Ordinance, where it came from, and what exactly we tried to design it to do. And if it's okay, I have some slides that I was going to share, if it's possible for me to do that. Let me see if I can. Is it possible to enable me to do that?
You should be able to do it now.
Yes. Yes,
Okay.
I have it on mute. I'm so sorry, Maxwell. Yes.
That's okay. We're all good now. Let me. Okay, everyone can see that? Cool.
Yes.
So as I said, I work at the Fair Housing Action Center. We're a 25-plus-year-old civil rights nonprofit working to end housing discrimination and segregation. And health and safety violations in rental housing are not something we can typically use the Fair Housing Act to do enforcement around, but they absolutely are a racial justice issue. And that's because dangerous rental housing disproportionately impacts low-income renters of color. It also disproportionately impacts homeowners of color as well, because historic patterns of segregation mean that Black homeowners in New Orleans in particular are more likely to live in neighborhoods that have been disinvested from, and live next to substandard rental housing that can, lower their property values and impact them in other ways as well. This has also historically been a racial justice issue. This is one of these is a photo from the March on Washington, and you can see the sign demanding decent housing now. The other is a photo from a protest in the civil rights movement, or the open housing movement in 1966, when Dr. King brought the civil rights movement to the North to focus on housing conditions. And this is a woman who was living in slum housing, but was showing a photo of her landlord's very nice suburban property to show the contrast there. We also got involved because for over a decade, one of the #1 calls that we've received from people stuck in substandard housing, I'm sorry, I'm a little distracted because I'm getting little notifications asking me to admit people. Is someone else doing that too? Or should I be in charge of that? Okay, great, thanks, Brooke. So I was saying we got involved because for over a decade, one of the #1 calls that we receive at the Fair Housing Action Center is people stuck in substandard housing asking for help, and we've never had a good answer for them. And just as an example, right, these are just a few photos from recent intakes in the last month or so, just from our partner organization at Southeast Louisiana Legal Services. They also are the other sort of recipient of a lot of these phone calls. And just to give you a sense of the longevity of the issue, right, this is a recent headline about Laura and Howard Russell's sort of notorious slumlords in the Uptown area. They own about 34 different properties. Most of them are small buildings. They own lots of units, but often in smaller buildings. And so this is from a 2020 article detailing all the different conditions that their tenants are experiencing now. But if you were to do a Google search, here's basically the same headline from 2010. They've been doing the same thing. No one has, and they actually were fined back in about 2014-ish. I think they had about $20,000 or $30,000 in fines. But the landlords absorbed it as the cost of doing business and quickly re-rented the properties, and are still sort of in the news now for serious health and safety violations. And part of the reason this continues, and the reason that even fines like this are so rare, is because tenants that are stuck in places like this have no recourse. You can't withhold rent in Louisiana or you'll be quickly evicted. And we advise people not to contact 311 or call the city unless they're ready to leave, like they have a new place to go, because there are no laws to protect renters from retaliation when they file a complaint. We're one of only 7 states in the country that has no anti-retaliation protections. So I know I imagine everyone is a little bit familiar with some of the bigger rental properties, the bigger apartment complexes that have made the news, right? This is a picture of one of the units in the Oakmont apartments, which was in Algiers, a Josh Bruno property that got so uninhabitable that the city actually had to evacuate tenants from there recently. But there are lots of negligent landlords who own smaller properties too. So this is from a client who worked with us in Southeast Louisiana Legal Services, from a double uptown on Harmony Street. You can see there's a serious hole in the roof there that was letting water in and creating mold throughout her house and was making her sick and ruined a lot of her belongings. And so this obviously has serious health impacts. Mold is a big piece of that, but that's just one example. We're also deeply concerned about heat and the impact that has. It kills more people as a weather event than any other weather event across the country and in Louisiana. And so this is just one example of there's a toddler that was sent to the hospital because the landlord refused to fix the AC. And so that is unfortunately not an uncommon occurrence. And this, we all know about what happened after Hurricane Ida when power was out, but this just happened on a normal June summer day, right? And this happens regularly because landlords don't repair AC units. And then we also think of this as, the lack of basic maintenance as a reason why our rental homes become so much more dangerous during serious storms. So as an example, this is actually a friend of mine whose home had regular leaks, and she would complain to her landlord regularly and ask him to fix them. And he would wait until, it wasn't raining and then come over and just sort of like paint over the brown spots on the ceiling where it was dripping and call it a day. And so not surprisingly, when Hurricane Ida rolled through, her ceiling collapsed and destroyed most of her belongings. She was out thousands of dollars having to try and find storage spaces right after the storm, and then was displaced from the city for over 4 months before she could find a place to move back. So these are the sort of things that make us think that if we had regular, if landlords had to regularly maintain their properties, we wouldn't have this kind of intense displacement after storms. So we think of this as a renter issue, but we also know it's a quality of life issue for neighbors and homeowners. It's a public health issue, a climate change issue, a disaster resilience issue. And so that's the slide. So I'm gonna quit with that. So you can see my face again. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the ordinance now and try and give a quick overview. So the goal was not to reinvent the wheel, but to use best practices from hundreds of other cities and tailor it to New Orleans. So obviously the problem isn't unique here. There are lots of other places that have similar issues and have dealt with it. And one of the ways that sort of bubbled to the top and was most typical of other places, Dallas, Omaha, Little Rock, Fresno, Minneapolis, Detroit, Boston, there's tons of them. But they all have some sort of a healthy homes like ordinance, and they start by requiring all rental properties to register annually with the city. And that may be new for landlords, but almost every other business already has to do this through an occupational license in New Orleans. Actually, if you rent anything else in New Orleans, cars, moving trucks, furniture, power tools, even your home as a short-term rental, you already are supposed to register with the city and pay some sort of fee annually. The only people who are exempt from that are landlords who rent long-term. And so this would just bring them up to the standard of other businesses. That registration also ensures that if there is an issue, the city knows who to call, whether that's the owner or the property manager. And then Dr. Avegno, the health commissioner, talked about this at the first hearing we had, but that a complete list of rental units would also be incredibly helpful in future disasters to make sure they can find people and distribute resources in a way that makes sense. And so once owners register their rental properties, they'll receive a certificate of compliance, which they'll renew annually or upon change of the owner. And when they register, they also self-certify that their properties meet basic health and safety standards. So no inspection is needed to register. It's just a self-attestation. And when we say basic health and safety standards, what we're talking about is that only the most serious violations are taken into consideration. So this is actually a place where we differ from some other jurisdictions, which require certifications on their entire minimum property maintenance code. We decided to be more lenient. We have a minimum property maintenance code already. It's 74 different building safety codes that apply to every occupied building. We took what we thought were only the 11 most dangerous violations. And so those include operating plumbing and electric, working heating and cooling, roofs, windows, doors, walls without holes, leaks, mold, or rodents. And that's the basic set of health and safety standards that we're applying. And the ordinance sets up a trust but verify system. So once everyone is registered and certified, the verification step begins in the form of periodic inspections every 3 years to ensure that those certifications are accurate and that the properties are actually up to code. A lot of other cities include everyone in those periodic inspections in order to root out the bad actors. We again chose to provide some exemptions to tailor this to New Orleans. And so the primary exemption from periodic inspections is for small landlords. And the ordinance defines small landlords as people who own their property as a natural person in their name, not as an LLC or a business entity. And then also own 4 or less rental units. So these are typically people who live on the other side of their double or in a triple and they rent out the other 2 units. And it's more likely that the owner is going to be attentive to serious health and safety issues because if you share a roof with your renter, it's going to impact you too. Because of our sort of relatively low density development here and the prevalence of these kinds of doubles and triples, we estimate that this actually accounts for exempting half of all rental units in the city from periodic inspections. So we have about 76,000 rental units in the city. This would exempt 38,000 of them. So it's a really significant exemption. The other exemption we've included is for affordable housing units, but only if they undergo a similar inspection as often or more often. And that's the case with nearly every affordable housing program we're aware of. They're required to undergo much more strict inspections and often every year, not every 3 years. The non-exempt properties that then remain and have to be inspected every 3 years include properties owned as an LLC or some other business entity, and any building with 5 units or more. So bigger apartment buildings and apartment buildings that are owned by someone who's doing this as a business. Those owners also complete a self-certification, and then the city will schedule an inspection sometime in the next 3 years to make sure that the self-certification is accurate. Units that pass don't get bothered again for 3 years. And both the administration and the author of this ordinance, Councilmember JP Morrell, have committed to hiring national experts to help implement the program so that it's not left entirely to code enforcement, because I think we all reasonably have some doubts about whether code enforcement could handle something like this. And so that is the sort of thing. National experts can bring in proprietary software to help find sort of recalcitrant landlords who are trying to avoid the system. They can also use their expertise to create a streamlined system for people who are doing the right thing. And so with that outside help, we think we could limit the demand on a large owner's time so someone who's getting inspected to 1 hour per year filling out forms for the registration, and then possibly a day or two every year or every 3 years to supervise inspections. So we're trying to really make sure that it is as easy as possible. So far we've talked about good actors, but for the bad actors, if a unit that fails inspection, the owner will actually have time to correct the issue before a second inspection. So we give people one freebie. It's only after 2 failed inspections in a row that enforcement starts. And enforcement will follow the typical rules that happen right now. So there's capped daily fines, and it allows an owner to contest a violation in an administrative hearing. And in the rare scenarios where owners refuse to comply, the city could eventually ask a hearing officer to pull a certificate of compliance. And if the hearing officer decides to do that, what that means is that the owner can no longer rent the unit legally. And this is the hammer that this ordinance provides that code enforcement does not currently have. It says, if we have found that you have consistently or intentionally defied us and intentionally avoided compliance or brought your property up to code, not only are we going to levy fines against you, but you can't bring in rental income off that unit anymore. And the other hammer in there is that once a tenant is vacated, they can actually shut the power off on that unit, so it can't be re-rented. That's something we can't do right now, and so that would be a big piece of the enforcement. Again, we assume this is going to be relatively rare because we know most landlords want to do the right thing and bring their properties up to code. But when that has to happen, and it's too dangerous for a tenant to live there, the ordinance also creates an anti-displacement fund that tenants in that position can apply for assistance to help move to a new place, put their things in storage and that sort of thing to help defray their costs. And then the ordinance also includes an anti-retaliation provision, similar to the ones that exist in nearly every other state, to try and protect people who do call 311 or do ask for repairs from their landlord. And the way those work is that they assume retaliation if a landlord is, trying to evict someone or taking some other adverse action within 6 months of a request for repair or a call to 311. But the landlord can pretty easily overcome that hurdle, that assumption that they're in the wrong, by just showing that they have any non-retaliatory reason to move forward with that eviction or adverse action. So as an example, if your tenant is behind on rent, that is a non-retaliatory reason why you might move for eviction, or if they have violated the lease in some other way. So it won't protect everyone. In fact, we're a little worried that there are some people who will definitely fall through the cracks. I can go into more detail about that in Q&A, but we still think it's a good start. And then, as with most of the cities that implement this kind of a program, it's designed to be revenue neutral, which means that the fees are set up to make sure that they cover the cost of operation and no more. We wouldn't actually be able to bring in extra revenue with the program, or then it would be a tax and not a fee. So like I said, this is new for rental property owners, but the annual registration fee is $60, and that's on par with what a lot of other cities do. And it's also on the low end of what nearly every other business in New Orleans has to pay right now for its occupational license. Those typically start at $50 to $60, and they range into the thousands of dollars depending on how much revenue you're bringing in. The periodic inspection fee is set at $150, which is also sort of similar to other cities and the cost of how much it costs to do that. As a reminder, though, it only gets assessed once every 3 years, not every year. And then it only gets assessed on typically a fraction of the units being inspected, because the ordinance sets it up so that not every unit gets inspected, but like a sample does of each building. And so that fee ends up getting spread over multiple years and multiple units. And then it's also important to note that complaint-based inspections will continue to function as they normally do. So the ordinance does not add any new fees for those. We did that on purpose to protect landlords against bad faith complaints. And we did a lot of research on these programs before recommending them, because we knew we would hear concerns about the fees raising rent. Obviously, we would be very concerned about that as well at the Fair Housing Action Center. But we haven't yet found any data to suggest that implementing a healthy homes program or something similar will systematically increase rents, or that cities with these kinds of programs have higher rents than those who don't. And a lot of that is likely because this is a market economy, and so most landlords don't charge rent entirely based on their costs. They charge rent based on what the market will bear. And so I think there is probably a subset of smaller landlords and folks who just want to take care of their tenants, who are charging, as low a rent as they can get away with just based on their costs. And for those folks, if they need to pass the cost of this program on to their tenants, we tried to set the fees at such a place that even if you're passing that cost on, especially for a small landlord, we're only talking about $5 a month. And so that is not the sort of thing that we worry about displacing, creating massive displacement or forcing a lot of renters to move. We've also tried to set up some supports for rental owners who want to do the right thing, but may just be short on capital. So this actually doesn't require an ordinance, but the Office of Community Development recently announced that it is creating a new rental repair program that's designed to assist more cash-strapped owners. So that would offer grants and loans to smaller landlords to fix up their properties in exchange for them holding, not jacking the rent on the tenant for a certain number of years afterwards. And then the last piece of the ordinance I'll share is a commitment to transparency. Currently, code enforcement issues can be traced through the city's one-stop app. This ordinance ensures that the public will continue to have access to data on violations, inspections, and whether the buildings have a valid certificate of compliance, just to make sure that that's available both to tenants who might be looking for a new place to live and they can look up their potentially new landlord's record, but also to landlords who are doing a good job to sort of tout their success and say, see, look, I passed my inspections, I'm doing a good job. So I think that summarizes the main points of the ordinance. Again, it was introduced September 15th. The first hearing was September 29th. And I can talk more. I think we're gonna come back to me maybe at the end to talk about where things stand now and how people can take action. So I'll leave that, but I'll just finish by saying we tried really hard here to sort of work with a lot of stakeholders and create an ordinance that's tailored to our city and is a relatively easy lift for good actors, while giving us the data and the tools we need to really root out and hold accountable the bad actors. And so thank you all for having us, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Maxwell. That was good. That was some good information you gave us. And we will ask you questions like at the end, because we have a couple of questions in the chat, I noticed in the chat, and you gave us a lot of information. So I'm sure that someone wants you to break it down just a little bit in details, but they will ask you the questions that they want you to explain. That's okay? Okay, good. Thank you. Next, we have Mr. Frank. Mr. Frank, you ready?
Yes.
Yes. So can you introduce yourself and tell us about yourself, your office, and your hard work that you are committed to do?
Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Yasin Frank Southall. Most folks just call me by my middle name, Frank. And I'm the Organized Community Engagement Manager at the Jane Place Neighborhood Sustainability Initiative. We're a community land trust and housing justice organization. We build permanently affordable housing in mid-city, so we are landlords and developers of housing. And we also conduct policy advocacy, research, and organizing work around a range of housing justice issues. In particular, over the past 4 years, we focused a great deal on the issue of renters' rights. We were one of the organizations that gave birth to the New Orleans Renters' Rights Assembly, which I'm a member of, and I was a member of that organization before I started working at Jane Place. And yeah, we do a range of things. Definitely feel free to go jpnsi.org. My job in particular is around community engagement, renters' rights education, outreach, and organized strategies. And yeah. Oh, sorry, Miss Valerie, you're on mute.
I'm sorry, I didn't even know I put myself on mute. But anyway, thank you for explaining, you explain us your title and what all you do. We really appreciate that, Mr. Frank. So we're gonna come back to you. I'm sure that we have some audience would like to ask you questions in detail, specifically what they want to know about. I'm sorry, you want to say something?
Yeah, I think Bethany wanted me to talk a little bit more about our work and how we intersect with this ordinance. Can y'all see me?
Yes. Well, you can continue. I was gonna go back to it, but since you're on the road, you can continue going.
Yeah, sorry about that.
That's all right.
Yeah, so basically where we're at is we created the first renters' rights hotline in the state solely focused to renters' rights back in spring of 2020, literally a month after the lockdown or shutdown began. And one of the things that we knew anecdotally, we knew through personal stories, the issues of habitability standards, we literally had no clue until we opened up that hotline, which is both in English and Spanish. And one of the things we learned is that the conditions underground in both big landlords and some small landlords are absolutely horrific. And what we learned through our research, working with Maxwell, things that Maxwell already knew, but things I didn't quite understand, is that our state is pretty much at the bottom when it comes to habitability standards. So, I think a lot of times in our city, we think that what we're experiencing in terms of dysfunction, the trauma, is normal. But the truth of the matter is the rest of the country has created better and stronger standards. And ultimately, what that leads to less people who are affected by Black mold, in terms of chronic health issues like asthma and other issues. It leads to less people having their ceilings collapse when there's like a horrific rainstorm. It leads to less people getting sick and having to take off time work when their heater goes out and their landlord ignores them about fixing it for a month or two. So there's all these conditions and things that other people around the country don't have to experience. So why is it in the state that has the second largest Black population, this incredibly working class state, why do we have to deal with these conditions? Why is it a state or a city where now the majority of folks are renters? And we know that when you break down racial demographics, Black people make up, when you look at subpopulations, we are the largest percentage of renters. As a matter of fact, at Jane Place, everyone who works there, all 7 full-time staff are renters. So when we talk about these issues, we're not just talking about them in an abstract intellectual way. We're talking about ourselves. We're talking about our own personal experiences, in big complexes, small complexes. Ultimately, though, as an entity, as an organization, we know the struggles of what renters go through beyond our organizing policy research work because we operate rental housing. And we often talk with tenants who have left different slumlords and they've moved into our properties in part because a ceiling collapse. A child develops asthma after literally visible Black mold being on the walls and the landlord not doing anything. I've experienced this myself because I had a distant cousin who operates slum housing in the city. And so I literally would have people I would introduce myself and people would go like, your last name? And I would go like, yes, I'm connected with the slumlord distantly. And people would just open up when they would realize that I wasn't siding with this guy. And I wasn't connected, financially. So the stories that people have told me have left a lasting imprint on me, in terms of why we support this policy, why we support this ordinance. And the truth of the matter about this ordinance is that is pretty much the most basic comprehensive standards. This brings us in line with places like Illinois, Ohio, Indiana, Kentucky. There's nothing in this ordinance that's terribly too radical. It's literally just the basic standards of what everyone else in the country get. If it's good enough for everyone else in the country, it's good enough for the people of Louisiana, in particular New Orleans. So I think that is really all I have to say. I think Maxwell did a really great job of giving a comprehensive overview. But I really just want to say that the people to be organized with, the tenants we help via our hotlines, they're depending on this ordinance. I talk to people all the time. We talk about moving out of this state because of the housing conditions. And so, yeah, I will pass on to Andrenica.
Miss Morrison, you up? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Miss.
Good afternoon. Oh, go ahead. Okay, so thank you, Frank, and thank you, Ms. Jefferson. Thank you all for having me here this afternoon, this early evening. Good evening to Justice and Beyond. And I appreciate the warm welcome. We are, like Max and Frank, longtime contributors and partners of Justice and Beyond. So happy to be back here again to talk about this issue so that we can hopefully get this enacted. I'm Andronika Morris. Today I'm wearing my Greater New Orleans Housing Alliance hat. GNOHA, as like the Fair Housing Action Center and Jane Place, have been long time champions of the Healthy Homes Ordinance. And the reasons for that, GNOHA is a slightly different organization than the Fair Housing Action Center and Jane Place, even though they're our partners, in that we're a collection of nonprofit and for-profit affordable housing developers, builders, agencies that work around housing. And this is not typically something that you see those kinds of cast of characters getting involved in. Their builders, their owners, their operators. And they normally do not like, and some of our members don't like this, but we feel very strongly, number one, it is the right thing to do for the people of New Orleans. Everyone has heard, you've seen from the earlier presentation, the truly terrible conditions far too many of our friends and neighbors and family members are living with here in New Orleans. And that has to stop. But there's also some very practical reasons why the GNOHA membership would support something like this initiative, even though, yes, number one, most of my members, most of their inventory is going to be exempt because they are meeting a much higher standard. They're being held to a much higher standard, the housing quality standards that HUD uses when it is funding any of its properties, and those are done on those inspections are done on an annual basis. I'm not going to pretend like those inspections are perfect. They are not, but there is a process in place. There is a system in place for those tenants to get relief. There are real consequences that are visited on the landlords. And this is something that the rest of the people of New Orleans do not have at their disposal. They cannot take advantage of. It is, and it's heartbreaking. As someone who I started my career working for the local housing authority, and getting phone calls from people who saw substandard property in their neighborhoods and assumed that those properties were Section 8 program, Section 8 funded or subsidized housing because of the way that they were kept. And people getting frustrated because they would call the housing authority, they would call other agencies, and they would be told, like, this isn't our responsibility. And they would assume that because it was run down, because it was ill kept, that this was what subsidized housing, what affordable housing actually was. And that's another reason why the GNOHA membership is in favor of the Healthy Homes Ordinance. We need to start unpacking the bias around affordable housing. Affordable housing is not synonymous with cheap housing, and it certainly shouldn't be synonymous with substandard housing. Everyone should be living at an acceptable level. And there is, and actually we have a slightly different situation here in New Orleans. People who live in subsidized housing actually have more protection. They actually have a better guarantee, a better chance of living in housing without the kind of problems that we've seen here tonight, as opposed to people who are living in housing that is not subsidized. And that is a problem, especially since we don't have enough subsidized housing to meet everyone's needs. The subsidized housing in New Orleans accounts for about a quarter of our market. We need much, much more than that. But right now it's only about 25% of the market. And that should not be that only 25% of the people who live here have any means of redress, have any means of addressing the kind of issues that, again, we've seen tonight. So those are the two big reasons why the Greater New Orleans Housing Alliance has been big supporters of the Healthy Homes Ordinance for quite some time, because like I said, one thing that needs to happen is we need to be talking about the fact that housing should be at an equal level across the board. Number two, we do need to end this very inaccurate stereotype that Section 8 and subsidized housing. I will share with you all one story when I went to work at the Housing Authority. A dear friend of mine is a native New Orleanian, I didn't know anything about public housing in Section 8 before I went to work at the Housing Authority. I'm from Edgar, Louisiana. We have public housing, but not Section 8, and was not really familiar with it. And I remember learning about the Section 8 program and how cool I thought it was that low to moderate income folks could rent in apartments just like everybody else and get assistance. And I told one of my friends as we were driving through Jefferson Parish about this program, and had she heard of it, this was really great. And with the confidence of a 23-year-old New Orleanian, native New Orleanian, she said, that's not a great program because the houses are trashy. And as we were passing an apartment complex in Jefferson Parish, she pointed to this rundown 8-plex that was with exterior stairwells that wasn't well kept. And she said, that's Section 8 with all of the importance that you all can imagine. And I was disappointed, to be frank. And so I went back to work the next day and I asked more questions, and they said, no, your friend does not know what she's talking about. She's making an assumption that that a lot of people hold, that if a house or home that's occupied by renters is substandard, that means that it is subsidized housing. And we need to stop. And one of the big problems that you have is that there's only a few places where you can get help with substandard housing. The Housing Authority is one of them, but they will not help you if it's not a property that they have any responsibility for. And because of federal rules that prohibit the Housing Authority from disclosing where their Section 8 tenants live, they will neither confirm nor deny in a lot of instances whether or not you've called into them and said, hey, we're calling in a report on, it must be Section 8. They won't say, no, that's not a Section 8 unit. They just won't deal with it, leaving community members frustrated, leaving community members confused, thinking that the Housing Authority, this is all only helped to reinforce the notion that agencies like HANO, who again, are not perfect, right? They're not, I'm not saying they're perfect, but what has happened over time is the reputation has been unfairly built around them, that they are not responsive to community complaints when they don't have any authority, when they don't have any power. And this is something that members of the council of previous era have actually helped cultivate it, right? They have stood up and publicly said that, Section 8 units are trashy in order to win elections and to pit renters against homeowners and low-income people against middle class folks. And that kind of rhetoric has actually worked. And it has created quite the divide here in New Orleans that thankfully we have worked really hard in the last few years to unpack. And this is the next step. We need to be codifying these policies. Now that most of us agree that our renters are not trashy in and of themselves, we need to codify that. We need to put into place rules that honor who our friends and neighbors are. And this is sentiment that is shared by most people. A few years ago, we conducted a poll. We found that 80% of New Orleanians want to see standards put in place, standards that are enforceable. And so when we hear from people the concerns about this, we try to take some of the fire out of it, because so much of this is wrapped up in bias and ignorance. So we try to, break it down to the data and the facts. You heard Max talk about the numbers. I remember the first go around on this, a landlord showed up and talked about the fact that he had 1,000 units, and that this in the old version, which was still about $60 for the annual registration fee, would cost him $60,000. And I'm like, dude, at average rent $900 a month, you're making $900,000 a month. $60,000 a year is a lot of money to everybody on this call. It's a lot of money to most of the people I know. It is not a lot of money to someone who's making almost $12 million a year. It's just not. It's really not a lot of money to someone making $12 billion a year. But that kind of exaggeration, because at the core, what you're hearing is these people aren't worth that. These people aren't worth a landlord who's making $12 million a year spending $60,000 to make sure that all of his units are accounted for, to make sure that all of his tenants have protection. And we disagree with that. We disagree with that notion completely. We know that the people of New Orleans are worth that and a whole hell of a lot more. So we are very proud to stand up for this, to support Jane Place and Fair Housing Action Center in their efforts to get this passed. Not all of our members are excited about this, but they also do all recognize that they do better. All affordable housing developers, everybody who does this work professionally, does better in a fair, straightforward, clear system. And that's what the Healthy Homes Ordinance will give us the next step towards. So I'm going to wrap up.
Thank you, Ms. Morris. You was very thorough. You was very understandable. Everybody can understand all three of y'all, Ms. Morris, Mr. Frank, Mr. Maxwell, just like we were 5 years old speaking Spanish. You all explained it very well, and we really thank you all. But now it's time that we ask questions. Do we have any questions from the chat? I see Mr. Sweet. You would like to ask your question, please, or you want someone to read it? But you freely to ask.
Thank you, Ms. Jefferson. I do have some questions. I haven't been able to make some of the renters' rights meetings lately, so I don't know where you guys are. What are the penalties for the smaller units? I get that they're not going to be periodically investigated, and maybe I missed this because I didn't come on the very beginning. What are the penalties for these smaller units, 1 to 4? Do they still have to pay the $60? And why does the 34 unit person pay $750 as well as the 10 unit person? It doesn't seem like it doesn't seem fair. And $750 is a lot of money, and it definitely would be passed down to the tenants, just like when they raised the taxes, when Errol Williams and his intelligence raised the entire taxes in the Treme. Rents went up, whether they do it for whatever reason. And $1 or $2 may not mean something to somebody who works for the Fair Housing Action Center, but it means something to us out here who are working in other areas. Money is money, and it going up is going up regardless of how small you believe it is. And so I'm wondering what is going on with that, and how are we able to make sure that everybody, regardless of the size of their properties or the units that they own, participate properly in this process.
I can start with that, and thank you for the question, Raymond. So I'm not sure where you're getting the $750 from, but it is $60 a unit, and that's based on the number of units that you own and register. So someone who owns, Laura and Howard Russell own 34 properties, and they own multiple units at each property. So they're going to be paying $60 per unit for each unit that they own. So the more units, the more it costs. If you're a small landlord and you own a double and you only rent out one side of it, that's the only unit you own, you only pay $60 a year. And like I said, that is pretty typical for what any business owner pays to the city every year as part of their occupational license. Well, it's on the low end of that, actually. And like we said, I hear what you're saying about it being passed along to tenants. And like I said, we would not be supporting this if we had data to suggest that that was going to displace a lot of people. The reason we're actually supporting this is because we think it's an anti-displacement measure, because so many renters have come to us and said, currently, right now, I have been displaced from my home because of my negligent landlord, and it cost me thousands of dollars. I lost thousands of dollars in my belongings because they were damaged by mold, by water. I had to find a place to move quickly and pay the moving costs and the storage fees. I lost my security deposit in the process. And so, those folks have come.
Max, you mentioned the 750 for the inspection. You don't
No,
remember?
150.
150. Okay, I heard
150, and that's every 3 years, and it's not every unit, so it gets spread out over. Yeah, and that's only again for larger landlords who own more units or own them as LLCs or business entities.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Sweet, for that question. Thank you, Mr. Maxwell, for answering that. Do any other speaker want to add on to that, or we can move on to the next one, Miss Morris or Mr. Frank? Okay, we can't hear you. It might be me. Okay, there you go. Okay. Yeah, you're going in and out. You have like.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. All right. So
Yeah.
we're gonna move on next. So we have Miss Michon, Michon. You have a question? I have a question. So we'll move on to Miss Lori. Miss Lori, you have a question?
Do you mean
you-
me, Laura? Or do
Yes,
you mean?
ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
Oh, my question was, if you're an owner and you have a renter that you're sharing with, like in a roommate situation, how does this apply?
Either one of the speakers can answer. It could be Mr. Maxwell, Mr. Frank, or Miss Morrison. But we see Mr. Maxwell. You ready? Answer the
I don't
question.
think that would apply because we're talking about full rental units, not just bedrooms. So that would be that's something that you would work out with your tenant separately. Because there's a definition in the ordinance of a rental unit, and it includes like an entire unit with full like kitchen and all the rest of the things that are separate. So if you're just renting a bedroom to somebody, that doesn't count.
Okay. Got it. She said she has it. Do we have any more questions, comments, concerns from the our participant? Okay, we have Miss Lane. It's unmute. Okay.
Yep. I put this in the chat. This is just to confirm what I thought I heard, and I may have heard incorrectly. Andronika, did you, or Ms. Morris, I'm sorry.
You said it right.
Did you see my question?
I do. I see your comment. So yeah, about a quarter of the rental units in New Orleans are subsidized in some form or fashion, either vouchers or tax credits or some kind of subsidy inside of them. And so all of those are inspected because of that. And if someone, not just a renter, if someone calls in a complaint for a unit that is not subsidized, right? A lot of people, I know I took these calls over the years, people would call Hano because of like the prejudice that my friend had, or the misconception that my friend had, that everything that was run down was Hano's fault. And so people would call. I got the phone calls and they'd give me an address and say, hey, this apartment is really falling down. Y'all need to come do something about it, because people know just enough about some of these programs on how they respond. But if it's not a Hano funded property, they have no authority. So if like my apartment or Max's apartment or where any of you might live, and you're not on any of these programs, there's no one we can call to, or if you live in a neighborhood, a lot of the people who called me lived in the neighborhood next door to something that was falling down and it was occupied. And they called Hano because the quality of life officer couldn't do anything, code enforcement couldn't do a lot of things. And so again, they made an assumption, and Hano has no authority over those people. Now I took the practice of telling people, hey, pulling it up, this isn't a voucher address. So but again, a lot of people were frustrated, and Hano had to walk a fine line with that, because again, they can't reveal, they can't by their actions confirm or give out the address of their voucher holders. So telling people, like, so if you called me and I was still working there and I told you I can't help you because it's not a voucher, okay, I haven't revealed anything. But if I say, okay, and I just hang up, I've just kind of confirmed for you that it is a voucher holder, right? So, but yeah, like most people weren't playing like that. But again, so they have to walk a fine line with it, but they don't have the authority. The Housing Authority of New Orleans does not have authority over every single property in the city. That's what the Healthy Homes Ordinance would do. It would give someone authority, namely the city, and give them to how Max described it. We'd also put in place a set of inspectors, a set of people who are ready to rock and roll and get this done.
So the follow-up to that is, and I apologize for my ignorance, but is that basically because all subsidized housing is under the authority of HUD?
So yes, basically. So it depends, but it depends on who's in control over it. HANO doesn't inspect everybody. So we have other properties, other subsidized programs that, namely, they're mostly from the state. They'll inspect their properties. HANO will inspect its properties, and that's basically everybody.
So when and this is a question for all three, when the new ordinance, let's just say, assume it passes and it comes into effect, will it do anything to centralize a
reporting system?
Yeah.
So it's interesting. I think, that's something that can be built upon, because one of the other reasons that in other places, when you do these kind of rental registries, now you got to have the same standards, but in other places, when you do healthy homes ordinances, eventually they all shift to everything being in one place. Because the HANO properties and the state properties or the state funded properties are actually held to a higher standard, we can't do that. But so hey, maybe we could get it to a higher standard for everybody. Wouldn't that be great?
Yes. Yeah. Thank you.
I want to add in one more piece, and thank you, Andronika. Y'all are incredibly lucky because Andronika has probably the greatest wealth of housing knowledge in all of New Orleans and experience. So I really appreciate you sharing all that, Andronika. But I just want to add in one other piece that I think is particularly useful here, which is that, because I got a question from someone who was like, but the housing, like this doesn't work right now. The Housing Authority does inspections, but like those units don't get fixed up. Here's why, and here's how we fix it, right? The Housing Authority does do inspections, right? If a tenant calls in a complaint or they do their annual inspection and a unit fails and the landlord doesn't fix it, that unit goes into abatement. The Housing Authority stops paying their portion of the rent on that unit, and that tenant gets to find a new place, take their voucher, and find a new place to live. Here's the problem. Once the tenant leaves that unit, there's nothing that requires that landlord to fix that property up. They can rent it back out to a market rate tenant in deplorable condition. Because the Housing Authority, once they stop paying the rent, they have no control over that unit anymore, right? The city is the one who's supposed to be in charge of buildings, health, and safety. And so the city could have control over that unit. And that's what we're putting in place, is a program to make sure that when the Housing Authority says, we can't rent you anymore, this place is a mess, the city can step in and say, we're going to actually do the enforcement here.
So under this ordinance, every single, whether you're dealing with a HANO unit, any other subsidized unit, every single landlord has to have a certificate, and there's access through that mechanism.
That's right, because even the HANO landlords would register and receive a certificate, and then if for some reason the HANO system fails, and again, it's not designed to catch everything, right? But if it fails in the way I've described, where HANO does its version of enforcement and says, we're not paying you anymore, and the tenant leaves, but then the landlord tries to rent it to another market rate tenant, that's where the Healthy Homes Ordinance enforcement can come in, because that tenant can now file a complaint and be protected from retaliation, and the city can come in and do an inspection and find that landlord, and if need be, if they are recalcitrant and don't fix it up, they can actually pull that certificate of compliance and say, you cannot rent this unit any longer until it is fixed.
But it sounds like it's a separate complaint process. So that's going to have to be communicated, I would think, to renters, that if they filed a complaint, HANO, stepped in, all the things fell through the cracks, they have to file another complaint with Healthy Homes.
Well, in the in the scenario I just described, there was a Section 8 tenant who left because the place failed inspection, and then a new tenant moves in.
Oh,
When the
okay.
new tenant moves in and it's a market rate tenant, then yes, we have to educate tenants to make sure they know to call complaints, but also if it's a market rate tenant, that unit has to be inspected regularly as well. So even if that tenant doesn't know, that unit will come up for inspection within the next 3 years.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Next, we have Ms. Brooke, then Mr. Bent. We're gonna ask everyone to be reminded of the time and ask your question within 2 minutes. That means we will give the speakers enough of time to explain your question. Thank you.
Okay, my question is pretty quick. And I think that I probably missed part of what Maxwell said at the beginning because I was doing a dozen different things. But I wanted to find out exactly how, when this city is notorious for not following through on enforcement, how we could possibly hope, and I hope I'm wrong, and I hope you have some magic potion that will get enforcement to follow through on the healthy homes ordinance. That I don't, even with the money going into a pot, I never see the city do what it needs to do to follow through on these things. So that's my horrible negative comment, but I know you've got a positive answer.
I can go first, and then Andronika, feel free to clean up my mess. Yeah, agreed. We have similar concerns, and that's why we are not leaving this one to magic. We have looked at other cities that have done this, and most cities our size, the smaller cities that do this sometimes do it in-house because they just need fewer inspectors, they have smaller departments, they can make it work. But most cities our size contract out most of different pieces of the program, specifically like often the registration process and sort of making sure that people register. So that's something that the city of New Orleans recently did with short-term rentals. Because our short-term rental enforcement was so abysmal, right? The mayor had to sort of be bullied into it, but they finally agreed to contract out some of that work to this international company that has a whole tech program that is designed to sort of, I don't really fully understand it, but they scrape like Airbnb's website and VRBO's website. Like they have like bots that crawl it and take pictures of everything and compare those pictures to like Google Street Images to match up listings. And if anything is illegal, they immediately flag it and can start enforcement like automatically. And so it would be something, they bring that kind of software that can help us make sure that people are not avoiding, signing up. But then they also have experience running the inspections. So these are, the sort of organizations that sort of built their expertise running inspections for housing authorities, and then have since expanded them to run inspections for other cities that have programs like Healthy Homes. So that is the goal, is that we know that the biggest problem we know the city and code enforcement has right now is really difficult for them to hire people, right? And so these sort of companies, they would hire locally, but they would be able to do it without the red tape that happens at the city. And so that's part of the, not magic, but sort of practical wizardry that we're trying to build in here.
And I would add to that, that's perfect, Max. I mean, again, nothing's perfect. And I also have to want to take a moment to urge everybody to kind of grapple with the idea that just with housing, do we only demand perfection? And that's a problem that we have in this city. Every time we talk about doing something for housing, everything from the NIF to the Healthy Homes, it's got to be perfect. And if it's not perfect, then we shouldn't do it. And the fact of the matter is that we're perfectly failing too many people. So let's stop doing that. Let's stop doing that perfectly. Let's stop abandoning and ignoring the needs of our friends and neighbors. Yes, there's going to be cracks in this system. That nothing's perfect, but giving renters the protection, giving our communities the chance to grow and get better. And then I also want to make sure that we talk about this. There's also, this is not just a hammer, right? There are horrible people out there who are managing properties, horrible.
who need to, if I could, I would lock them in their properties for a couple of months to punish them for what they have done. But there are also people out there who, because of the same systemic barriers that have disinvested in our neighborhoods, particularly our majority African-American neighborhoods, also can't access the kind of capital to fix up their properties, to make sure that their properties as landlords are wealth building assets. When we talk about home ownership and closing the racial wealth gap in this country and in this city in particular, that starts and begins with renters. Most people don't think about that. They think about homeowners, getting off the government teat and getting yourself a house and doing all these things like that. If you want to build wealth generationally, it has to start with renters, meaning you're going to be a strong renter, you're going to be stable and safe, and then be able to move into a first-time home ownership program, live in your home, and it becomes generational wealth when you die. And hopefully you will have been able to keep it up. And it's passed on as an investment, as an asset to your children, who will then rent it out. If they flip it and sell it, that's short-term money. The long-term money is your heirs become landlords, and they've got to be good landlords. And they can't be the kind of landlords that we see all too often in this city. And they've got to have the ability to do that. So the program, Max mentioned the program that the city's starting, I would put my other hat on if I had it. Housing NOLA has launched a small program. We've got $1.5 million to help small landlords fix up their properties as well, in partnership with the rental registry. We want to make sure that we want to get more banks creating these investment products. This is a big problem. If you own your own home, or if you own a small piece of property, there's only one lender that will lend you less than $40,000 against your property. That's incredibly problematic. So we've got to create this market. We've got to cultivate this market, and we've got to have guardrails. No one's going to make these changes if the city of New Orleans doesn't clearly indicate that it cares that these standards are met. No bank is going to lend no bank is going to change the way they do business when the city of New Orleans as a collective keeps saying, well, we don't care about almost 60% of our renters, where they live and how they live.
Thank you for explaining that. We have the Mr. Ben, and we're gonna let Miss Betty be the last question verbally. I do see a question in the chat, so we're gonna ask Mr. Maxwell, Miss Morrison, can you answer Mr. Raymond question in the chat while Ben is asking his question?
You want me to go now?
Yes, please.
Okay. As you know, pre-Katrina, there was a lot of public housing throughout the city. The Big Four, Iberville, St. Bernard. Who was responsible pre-Katrina for checking the units at that time? Now, it's not just in this city, but public housing was weaned down all over the country. So who was responsible pre-Katrina for checking the public housing units to see that they were kept up to standard?
HUD was, and they weren't doing their jobs. That's why we tore them down.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, yeah, that's how that HUD was supposed to do that. And HUD was supposed to make sure that it happened, and they didn't. That's why they deteriorated to the point that when Hurricane and that Katrina happened and the funding came, they seized the opportunity to demolish the buildings because they had been allowed to deteriorate to an absolutely unacceptable level. And they decided to tear them down.
Okay, straight to the point, Ms. Morrison. That's what I'm talking about. Next, we have Miss Betty.
Hey guys, thanks for coming this evening to talk to us about this. And Maxwell, I appreciate all your answers to my emails in the last month. But my question is really a bigger question about housing in this country. I'm almost beginning to believe that the reason that we keep our housing availability the way it is a racial issue. Because I have friends in Germany who are, one of them is a professor at a university, not making a lot of money. And the other one is the husband's in the tech business. They have 2 children and they qualify, y'all, for affordable housing in Germany. In fact, Andronika, you went to visit Heike, my friend. You were over there with her. And so I've really been thinking about it a lot, that my 19-year-old, my 40-year-old son, he makes $19 an hour, lives at home because he can't rent anything in the city, making $19 an hour unless he's got a roommate. And most of the time that's back and forth. But tell me what you guys think. Will we ever change these housing policies in this country to be more fair to middle income and including poor people? I mean, anyway, it's just, after meeting this woman from Germany, I was just blown away by the fact that their housing, a lot of their rent was paid. So I'm curious as to what you think will happen.
So I believe that we have to start that conversation at the local level. Looking to the federal government for a top-down solution, that's not how real change happens. We have to, because again, so many of the rules that govern how we live are at the local level. Our zoning laws, our building codes, all that stuff is local. So the change has to start here. And the good news is with the Healthy Homes Ordinance, we've got another concrete step moving forward. We've taken a couple over the years, but they have been slow and far and in between. And this is another one that's just taken too long. So we want to see those kinds of changes. This is critical to that. It's absolutely critical to it. We have got to say that renters are people, that renters are our neighbors, that renters deserve decent homes, and that that we as New Orleanians will no longer accept just because you don't pay a mortgage, that you should be consigned to something less than, and with no protection, with no help, with no recourse.
Okay. Thank you for that, Ms. Morrison. We really appreciate it. Now it is, I have 2 minutes, so I want to make my little comment that we as renters or landowners, if we have an issue or a concern we have, no one cannot help us unless we tell them, unless we go to the proper office or the proper person to tell them. The city councilman cannot assist us unless we inform them. Then after we inform them, the next step is to make them accountable. As a renter, make them accountable to force the landlord to update their property. If the renter is a problem to the landlord need to report it. So both parties need to play a very important part in keeping us in the healthy house mentality, healthy house city and a community. So with that wrapped up, we're going to ask Mr. Maxwell and Ms. Morrison to give us your wrap up, your last point, for we can think about and meditate on it and move forward in helping you all to make us a healthy house city.
Thank you, Ms. Mallory. I will wrap up by saying that we are closer now than we have ever been to enacting this. We had a hugely successful hearing on September 29th. It was packed with supporters that waited 3+ hours to share their stories with council members. I know that we have generated hundreds of phone calls and emails as a collective to council in support of this ordinance. And so it was delayed last Thursday. They were supposed to vote on it last Thursday and they delayed it. And there has been some talk about an amendment that would exempt all 1 to 3 or 1 to 4 unit buildings from inspections. And that worries us a lot because it would exempt about 2/3 of all rental units in the city. And we know at the Fair Housing Action Center that half of the complaints that we get about properties like this are at those small 1 to 4 unit buildings. But none of that has been released publicly yet, so it's not final. What was clear though on Thursday is that it seems like the vote would, well, it was clear that, you know, a bunch of folks showed up to say, we want to see a vote soon. and council seemed to respond to that and suggested they were going to have this final vote on November 3rd. And so we believe we have the support to get this done. We believe the city is behind this, but we don't take anything for chance. And so I dropped a link in the chat, which is our Take Action page. It helps guide people through making a quick phone call to their council members in support of this ordinance. We would ask you to do that if you feel so moved. Again, we just want to keep the pressure up for the next week and a half, and then we think we can finally get this done on November 3rd. So we would ask you to join us at council if you can make it, or at least make a phone call in support.
Thank you. We sure will spread that out on our social media and our network as well. Thank you, Mr. Maxwell. Next, we have Ms. Morrison.
Afternoon. Well, thanks again. I'm actually trying to answer Laura's question. Max, the Healthy Homes Coalition has it has it on here, the ordinance, right?
On mute, Matt.
Oh, sorry, I'll drop the actual link to the ordinance in there. Yeah.
Yeah,
1 second.
that's what everybody's looking for. So I don't think I need to add anything else other than we do need everybody's support. We do need to ensure that we don't end up with a watered down version that doesn't actually help everybody, that doesn't get this moving in the right direction. There is unfortunately a risk of that. We have seen this before. Like I said, when we did the poll a few years ago, 80% of New Orleanians unequivocally support this. Our leaders have ignored it for far too long, and we can't keep doing this. And I want everybody to remember that as we see our council respond to concerns, real concerns that people have, we see the mayor's office respond to concerns, real concerns that people have. This is the area where we have not seen adequate response and response, frankly. And this is the area where the stakes keep getting higher. I got to remind everybody that as we get upset about whatever it is your issue is, be it potholes or short-term rentals or whatever your issue is that is really important to you, and that it is important to you, nobody's died around this. And Max showed you a picture earlier of a toddler who almost lost her life. But I also want to remind everybody about the number of our neighbors who died after Hurricane Ida just last year. And the fact that we still haven't done anything about this is it speaks to the fact that we still don't understand that how we're all at risk, all the people who died because of heat exposure, because and again, the council tried to do something about this. They didn't. Now we actually have the framework to get started to make sure that landlords do not put people, particularly elderly and vulnerable tenants, at risk when the worst should happen, or just because it's Monday. So I'd urge all of you to think about that as you're talking to your friends and neighbors about this, and how important this is, because this is literally life and death.
Yes, and we only have one life to live. Thank you. Thank you for this wrap up. It was very informative. We thank you for Mr. Maxwell, Ms. Morrison to come in and explain this audience to us, explain the situation, explain the people who out there in need of healthy homes. Because if we do not live in a healthy home, we'll be out there in the streets. Then at the same time, if we do not have a healthy home, it will cost us more money that we do not have. So we thank you again. We appreciate it. Do anybody have any announcements? You can put your announcement in the chat, and we would take away from this that we will show up and speak up at November 3rd council meeting, right, Mr. Max? Yeah. So it's time for us to speak up, stand up, and show up at this at this meeting come November 3rd with the councilman. Let them know that the people is speaking, and we don't do nothing but show up and sit down, but we be in their presence. So more than ever, the more powerful this will be. So do anybody have any announcements?
I don't have, Val,
We
I
actually-
don't have an announcement, but I wanted to say that Blaine and I both posted in the chat about the constitutional amendments. We were going to try to get some time to discuss those a little bit, but I think we're kind of pushed on time. But I would say to everyone, look at the Louisiana Budget Project vote document that I put in there.
Betty,
Yeah.
well, we do have like 9 minutes. You can tell us the most important ones, no?
Well,
explain about, yeah, we have 9
yeah,
minutes.
they're all important, guys, but I would say that the one that's become the most controversial is the number 7 from the Louisiana Budget Project. To look at it, I'll talk about it just briefly. It's number 7 says, do you support an amendment to prohibit the use of involuntary servitude except as it applies to the otherwise lawful administration of criminal justice? And the Louisiana Budget Project says what this does, Louisiana's Constitution and the 13th Amendment to the US Constitution bans slavery and involuntary servitude, but allows involuntary servitude as punishment for a crime. This amendment would change the language to ban slavery and involuntary servitude, except as it applies to the lawful administration of criminal justice. Their analysis, though, is interesting, and it says the original intent of this amendment was clear and noble: to strip Louisiana's Constitution of the antiquated language rooted in racism that has been used to justify harsh prison labor and has contributed to the over-incarceration of Black men. In practice, there are different interpretations of what this amendment would do and whether it would have any practical effect. Representative Jordan, who wrote the legislation for this amendment, is now asking people not to vote for it, because the language, by the time it got to this amendment, the language wasn't what he had intended it to be. He thinks that if you vote no and it doesn't pass, that he will be able to go back to the legislature and get a different amendment next year. And I'm not sure. I'm not sure about that. And this afternoon, I talked to Bruce Riley at Vote because I heard that Vote is asking people to vote yes, just to say we support not having that language in our Constitution, that we don't want that. And they think it will just show support. Yeah, the Power Coalition, thank you, Raymond. The Power Coalition is also saying the same thing. Bruce said today that they are not publicly out speaking about it, but they think if people vote yes for it and it passes, that it's at least saying to the legislature, we want change in this state around this involuntary servitude in prison. He said, if it doesn't pass, they're concerned that the legislature will say, hey, look, nobody thinks this is a problem. So why in the world why are we going to do this again? They're thinking that it might not ever get back to the voters again. So I'm sharing this with you because I started out voting no for it because I listened to Jordan, but after I got out of the Zoom call listening to him, I kept thinking, how in the world will this? I've been to the legislature. I know how bad it is up there. I cannot imagine them promoting taking this language out because they're racist. That's period. That's it. So I personally am leaning with Vote, and Sarita, I think, is saying the same thing, and the Power Coalition. So I think everybody's going to have to look into this and read on it as much as they can. The rest of them don't seem to be, if you've got questions about the rest of them, if anybody's got a question, but the Louisiana Budget Project has done, they say that they represent middle income and below middle income people in the state, and they are very cautious about our taxes. So I would say take a look at the amendments and it will help guide you. They've got it into a language that you can understand what it is. But number 7, if you're concerned about it, do some more research on it, ask us questions about it. But as I said, I was going to vote no, along with what Representative Jordan said. But after talking to Bruce Riley today, I think I'm more in line of sending a message. So that's, I'm looking at Raymond's is the last one with just letters and numbers. Let's see.
Oh, why you
The
looking
Power
at
Coalition,
Raymond?
yeah, is the last one with just letters and numbers that will throw people off. What?
Yeah,
Which one is that, Raymond?
the very final amendment on my sample ballot for Ward 6, any precinct, just letters and numbers and no real explanation. It's
Jimmy,
like,
are you talking about the local one? The last one that's the parish-wide home rule charter proposition, or another
yeah,
one?
that one. It doesn't say anything about home rule charter or anything on that line on my sample ballot.
Okay, well, the last one on mine is the parish-wide home rule charter. I don't know whether you've got something different on there. It says to require city council confirmation of appointments by the mayor, or are you talking about the constitutional amendment number 8?
Oh, I don't know. It's one that says like just letters and numbers. There's no like wording or anything else on there.
Okay, I don't have that on my ballot, so I don't know. I'm not sure what you're talking about.
Can I speak in?
Yes.
Yeah.
The home rule charter provision, the Louisiana Tribune has very strongly worded. I think I have it. I'll put the link in. It's basically asking people to weigh in on whether the city council should have the power, should be required to confirm the mayor's nominations for office, which is very contested. Some people feel that, and they basically, and I'll see if I can find their take on this. I was surprised, frankly. They feel that it's an unwarranted and discriminatory curtailment of the mayor's powers.
They don't live in New Orleans.
They don't live in New Orleans. Yeah. I mean, I have very different views, but that's basically what that's saying. If you vote for it, that's what's maybe confusing, is that it's not clear whether by voting yes, you're voting for the city council to have that power, or you're voting for it not to have that power. I just wanted to add one other thing though, while I'm looking for this. I just want to make it clear that and I'm with Betty, and Betty well knows, and so does Brooke. As a former criminal defense lawyer, I've seen so many distortions and read into the law to provide for just horrendous practices in the criminal legal system. I cannot bring myself to call it the criminal justice system. But the only problem with that amendment, and I think I'm going to vote for it now based on Betty's discussion with vote and whatnot. But the problem with it is that it has the language that was inserted about other lawful criminal justice processes. It's completely ambiguous. If that gets through, and I'm only asking you to pay attention to this so that you keep your eyes open for what happens if it's passed. And I think it probably will pass. But if it is passed, it can be, you can drive a Jeep through the ambiguity in it, so that, for example, one of the results could be that, a probation department or the probation department could then say, well, you're going to have to work off your fines your probation, the cost of your probation, or you're going to have to work off your court costs. I can see one of the river parishes, pulling a stunt like that. So it could greatly expand the scope of involuntary servitude. I mean, but I agree. The message that I think the message that it will send to the legislature would be, if you vote against it, because it's very badly written, is that they shouldn't bring it up again. No, people don't want this. People aren't interested in it. And because of the racism in Baton Rouge among our legislators, I think that's probably how they would respond. Anyway, I just want to throw that in. And I'm going to try to find.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that, Lane. Betty.
Yeah, Val.
I was Betty. We thank everyone, even Mr. Raymond, but the time has first spent. It is 6:32, and we like to be very aware and cautious of everyone's time. So with that said and done, Mr. Raymond, with that said and done, we want to again thank everyone for attending. The action that we will do next will be visiting and attending the city councilman meeting November 3rd. With that said and done, we're going to ask Mr. Richard to lead us in prayer and cover us. Thank you, Mr. Richard.
Thank you. Let us bow our heads. And thank you, Lord God, for covering us and protecting us and guiding us and loving us. And thank you, Lord God, for making us, creating us as your children in your image, for loving us as your children. Help us to love each other as you love us and have taught us to love. And help us to work in defense and protection and care of all in you. Amen.
Amen. Amen. Thank you again, Miss Morris and Mr. Maxwell. See you later. Y'all be safe.